It's wonderful to know that we're here to have a conversation about education in a pandemic and what we can learn from students, caregivers, and parents who are living through what we can all agree is absolutely uncharted territory, because we're going to have work ahead. This is having a deep impact on everybody across the state. It's having impacts in ways I think we understand. It's having impact in ways we do not understand. And if we want to make sure that we are ready for the next steps, then those steps need to be informed by the people that we are most interested in supporting and guiding. And that means we need to listen. I am delighted that as we have this conversation, our report has come out. The conversation you're going to have today, you're going to be guided and very capably by Jessica Ramos, who is the Director of Community Engagement at Advance Illinois, and who spearheaded efforts to run focus groups all across the state to sift and to sort and to make sense of those, along with Melissa Figuera, who's a Senior Policy Associate at Advance Illinois, who has been working for the last 9 months to understand what the data is telling us, what research of other extraordinary disruptive events means for students and families and school systems. And then I'm really delighted that we're going to be joined to have a panel conversation at the back end by Brian Minsker, who is the immediate past president of the Illinois PTA, and by Dr. Arthur Culver, who is superintendent of East St. Louis School District, both of whom, in addition to giving this a great deal of thought and to being leaders in their areas, also were very helpful and supportive in putting us in touch with families, students, and caregivers. So I think you're going to get a chance to hear from them how this information meshes with what they're seeing and how this information does or does not help as they think about the next steps. And the next steps, I mean, one of our mantras, and you'll see it matters that we listen right now. This is, as I said, uncharted territory. And if we want to put together programs and we want to put together policies that are going to be the most beneficial for our students and families, we need to understand what they're grappling with, what's top of mind for them, what they're experiencing, and some of the ideas that come to their minds about what they need, not only now, but as we come out of this and get to the point where we can rebuild, recover, renew from this pandemic. We have long believed at Advance Illinois, for those who know us well, that research, we try to be on top of research, we try to be on top of best practice, we try to make sure that we are as sharp and as informed as humanly possible, but we believe that equally important to developing smart policy and smart programs is making sure it's grounded in real world experiences so that we are listening, and then working collaboratively and collectively with people on the ground. So we hope this report exemplifies that, lays the groundwork for the work ahead. And with that, just want to thank you all for joining us and giving us your time and your thinking. And I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Ramos.
Morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be sharing the findings of our report today. And I'll actually start with really what got us started. So throughout the months of September and October, with the help of many partners, when I tell you all that it took a village to make this happen, I do not say that lightly. And many of you are joining today, so thank you all for being here. With the help of our partners, Advance Illinois convened over 120 students, parents, and caregivers in rural, urban, and suburban communities from across the state, because we wanted to better understand their schooling experiences and how they've been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see, we engage students and parents of diverse racial, ethnic, and regional backgrounds. We engage parents that identify as essential workers, parents and caregivers that are caring for students with special needs and students that qualify for English language learner services. And truly here, I just want to name that it was extremely important for us to engage a diverse set of stakeholders that reflected the true diversity of our state and the students that we seek to serve and impact in the recovery. And, through these conversations, we heard many things. And what you're about to hear now is a summary of some of the most important findings that we have. But stay tuned, there will be more coming in the year to come. So before we even started talking about the educational experiences of students, we wanted to hear directly from communities how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting them. The primary and key challenge that parents and even students shared was lack of access to childcare. This was especially true for parents that identify both as essential workers. In some situations we had parents that one parent was working at a hospital, another parent was a firefighter, and they were struggling to keep up with how their children were doing at home and finding challenges with obtaining childcare, given the risk that they're putting themselves in the work that they do. We heard stories from children and high school students about how they are having to put the hat on of a homeschool teacher to support their younger siblings. And in other stories and situations, we heard some share that some parents are having to take their younger children to work with them in order to support them through that learning. We also heard all across and in every single group that we engaged that there's an increased financial insecurity that communities are experiencing. This was especially true in the conversations that we had with immigrant families and with working class families, where in these communities and in these conversations, their biggest focus was making sure that the basic needs of students were being met of their children. They said, I can't think about how they're going to get online on the internet if they don't have food on the table and then there's no roof over their head. So their most important focus was making sure that students were safe and protected during this time. Another challenge that was named were the barriers to accessing healthcare and mental health services. We especially heard that in our rural communities where first of all, the access to COVID-19 testing is more limited and further away from them. So we found stories where students were having to quarantine for 14 days or longer because they didn't have access to the testing necessary in order to know whether they were okay to go back to school or not. And similarly with parents impacting their access to employment. So before I go into the educational experiences of our students and what we'll need to think about as we think about the road ahead, I cannot go without thanking our educators. The efforts of the many, many educators that are on the front lines right now, whether they're working in the school, in person, in a school building, in a hybrid setting or remotely, our educators are working harder than ever to serve our students and getting creative about how to meet the needs of our students and educate them in a situation that none of us have ever encountered before. And the reality is that despite the incredible efforts of our educators, our education system is going to need guidance and resources and supports to ensure that as we think about the road ahead, both now as we're living through this pandemic and in the recovery, that we prioritize equity and ensuring that we meet the needs of our students that are most impacted, because the pandemic has not impacted everyone equally. Additionally, before considering the academic needs of our students, it is important to name and honor the humanity of our students. This time is traumatic for everyone. And in our conversations, we're hearing that need for social, emotional, and mental health supports has increased more than ever. And as I mentioned, some students are going to need more support than others. Despite the efforts of parents and educators, our students shared that they feel isolated and disconnected, especially our students that have been learning remotely. They shared a phenomenon that we call cameras off, voices off, where students are making friends with box shadows, similar to what we see on Zoom. They have not seen their classmates before. Teachers are teaching to virtual classrooms that are shadow boxes, and they don't have the same pleasures of encountering our students and building those relationships that are so important and that I definitely remember from my time in the classroom. Our students and caregivers are sharing that there's an increased need for counselor and social worker capacity and support. Pre-pandemic, our students were able to ask to go to the counselor's office or to the social worker's office. That right now is limited or non-existent given the current limitations. And the reality is that the things that we were hearing were applicable in the remote setting, in the hybrid setting, and even in person. because of the safety precautions that are in place to ensure that we prevent the spread of COVID-19. Participants recognized growing unmet social emotional needs and concerns about the development of students, and especially our high school students and our students in K-12 that are missing these what we call rites of passage. They're missing graduations, homecoming dances, and some of these experiences that we so vividly remember from our experience in high school that our seniors were seniors that in March did not get to experience. The other thing is that parents of our youngest learners share concerns about the developmental delays that may happen because our youngest learners need hands-on learning and practice, and those relationships and the ability to build relationships is something that we learn in our early years. And I'll kick it to Melissa.
All right, hello everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. So I think Jess kicked us off by giving us a nice grounding in one of the major themes that our focus group participants shared, that being the impact that the pandemic is having on social, emotional, and mental health. The flip side of the coin of the educational experiences that we heard about from students and families was the academic side. So what is happening in terms of student learning and growth since school was disrupted in the spring of 2020? And the first thing that we heard is that despite the best efforts of teachers, administrators, and district leaders who are going above and beyond to make this, kind of crazy circumstance work for all students, we're finding that students are having differential access to instruction. So they noted that both kind of the quantity and quality of instruction has been impacted by the pandemic. And I think we expected this, especially in the spring when learning so abruptly shifted to a virtual modality without the kind of resources, training, and supports that typically go behind setting up pedagogy in a virtual world. But what we heard from focus groups in the fall was that that is kind of continuing. And whether that's because teachers are really spending a lot of time on social, emotional, and mental health needs to address trauma, or just because it is incredibly difficult to shift from in-person to online, that kind of disconnect in quality and rigor of work persists. And we're seeing that students report that rather than critical thinking and a focus on kind of applying concepts, a lot of work in the current modality is focused on review and practice of concepts. So the second thing we heard was that I know we're all kind of hungry for more information. This is a time plagued with a lot of uncertainty. And what we heard was that students and caregivers especially want information in this time about whether they're on track academically. So both students and caregivers kind of expressed that they view school as a place where kids are gaining competencies and skills that they can apply and kind of help them to achieve success in college, career, and life. And they need to have markers in order to measure whether they're making that progress. Typically grades serve that purpose, but we saw a lot of kind of confusion about what those old markers like grades meant in a pandemic world and whether they could be comparable across districts. Finally, we kind of gave some polls to try to see what kinds of data or information caregivers usually prefer to rely on in order to understand their performance. And we asked students the same question. So how do you know that you or your child are progressing academically? And we kind of heard responses all across the board. You can see from the charts that typically it seemed that parents really value knowing where their students are performing in relation to state standards. So are they performing where they should be for their grade level? We also saw that if you look at student responses, they tend to put a lot of value on graded work and teacher feedback. So this is not surprising, but it does kind of show us that we need to be kind of thinking intentionally about the different mechanisms through which we're delivering feedback to both students and caregivers. Go to the next slide. The other thing we were curious about going into these focus groups was we know that disruptions to the last school year and the current school year have really impacted the amount of time that students are able to dedicate to learning and instruction. Last year in the spring of 2020, when school buildings closed, essentially there was kind of an impact or disruption to about a third of the last school year. And that's a huge chunk of students' learning time. So we were wondering if in the future, one of the ways we could consider as a system helping kids get back on track might be adding time to the school year or school day. How would parents, caregivers, and students prefer to see that additional time built into our learning system? And what we saw was that about over a third of respondents thought that it might be useful to extend the school year in order to provide kids with that extra time. About a quarter each thought that you could be creative by lengthening the school day or potentially transitioning to a year-round schooling model, which has been piloted in certain places across the country. And that would hopefully, according to them, kind of combat the summer slide or learning loss that happens when kids are on break for a protracted amount of time. So in addition to kind of that, two sides of the coin of mental health and academic progress or learning and how that's impacted by the pandemic, the third set of themes we saw really related to equity and issues with equity and inequity that were already existing in our education system that have been exacerbated and kind of worsened or just kind of brought to the forefront by the pandemic that we'll have to address in order to support learning recovery. The first one of these, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to anyone, is just the impact of the digital divide. And we heard from focus group participants that this digital divide has multiple facets, some of which the state and districts have done a great job of really trying to address quickly and meaningfully in terms of getting devices and broadband connectivity in the hands of students. But in these fall focus groups, we heard that this is still an issue, especially in rural areas and low-income school districts. So we still have kids who are not necessarily able to connect. And if you can imagine just how much broadband it takes to have 3 or 4 kids on the same network connecting at the same time to do virtual learning, this is just a problem that we've never really had to tackle before and still will require some significant input. And the other aspect of the digital divide we heard about was just in addition to devices and connectivity, making sure that, that kind of cultural shift or pedagogical shift that needs to come into play for high quality virtual learning also has to be there. The second kind of dynamic that we saw in terms of inequities across the state is just funding disparities. And I think many of you are familiar with, we have over 850 school districts in Illinois, across which there's just a huge variation in the amount of resources and funding available to them. So we have districts that, according to the state's evidence-based funding formula, have twice as much as they need in terms of funding to provide kids with a high quality education. And then we have other districts that have just over half of full funding. And we really saw those disparities kind of come to the forefront in how well prepared districts were to weather this storm. And it's one of the things that we are going to have to pay attention to, kind of addressing those disparities if we're going to support learning recovery. The last dynamic that we saw when it came to equity was interesting because it happens both across districts and within the same schools and districts. And that was that students especially reported that there was a difference in the amount of rigor and kind of quality of their coursework, depending on the types of classes that they had access to. So if we had kids in advanced placement or international baccalaureate, IB programs that had kind of an external test or benchmark or standard that they were being held to, they reported, really still being able to kind of work hard and be engaged, whereas students that were kind of in regular courses or not the honors courses typically reported that they were kind of more focusing on worksheets and didn't feel as challenged and engaged by their levels of schoolwork. All right, so that's a lot of information. And as we kind of listened to parents and caregivers and students, kind of identified the themes in the qualitative data that Jess and myself have now gone through, we tried to think, taken all of that information, what recommendations do we think the state education system should think about in order to address learning recovery? What we came up with was the following 5. The first is to invest in resource equity. So this goes back to kind of the funding notion on the previous slide about equity. And what this really means is 2 things. The first is that we need more funding in order to make sure that schools have the resources to support learning recovery. That can come from state sources and hopefully come from federal sources in some kind of stimulus package. But the important thing is that this money not only is additional dollars, but it's distributed in an equitable way. So it's targeted to those districts and schools that have the highest levels of need and currently are the most underfunded. The second recommendation is to try to make sure that we really are not thinking about social emotional learning and academics as two separate things, but we're thinking of them as inextricable from one another. Those two halves of the whole child are both something that schools and school communities can really take responsibility for and support. They're already doing so, but they need additional kind of resources in order to really make sure that they're addressing the needs of the whole child. The third is to kind of create a comprehensive recovery and rebuilding plan that takes the long view. So I know that when we are kind of continually trying to digest and prepare for what is happening, we've been in crisis mode for a long time. And part of responding to that is just responding to immediate need. What can we do right now to serve our students and families well? And though essential, that's only kind of one time horizon that we have to be planning for as a state. We know that the impacts of this pandemic and the impacts it's had on education will have a meaning for students and families' lives in the long term, which necessitates planning for long-term recovery. So this won't be kind of like, in the next few months or next year, all of this will be able to be addressed. We have to be thinking, 3 to 5 years out, how can we really make sure that we are rebuilding and renewing the system in a sustainable and equitable way? Fourth is prioritizing clarity and consistency. And this goes back to that point that students and caregivers made about just the need for information. People are hungry for data and as much information as possible, whether quantitative or qualitative, about how kids are faring right now. People don't want this to kind of be a black box where they have to kind of make assumptions or use anecdotes about what is happening. So the state can really truly play a role and add value by collecting data about what our students and families are experiencing and what our school districts are experiencing. And that data can in turn inform how we target supports in the future. And finally, to the point of making up lost time, this may be something that there's not currently full consensus on, but there are different creative ways that research has shown us we could potentially add time to the school day or school year in a way that allows us to really truly give kids the supports they need to not only kind of get back on track, but even thrive beyond the current crisis. All right, so I'm going to kick it back to Jess, who's going to bring on a couple panelists that we have. I know we just shared a lot of information, but we're going to hopefully unpack some of it with you guys now.
Thanks, Melissa. So if you have not added your questions onto the Q&A, I encourage you to please submit your questions, engage on the chat, whatever floats your boat. But if it's a question, make sure you put it on the Q&A. I am very excited to welcome Arthur Culver, the superintendent of the East St. Louis School District, and Brian Minsker, the immediate past president of the Illinois PTA. And before even starting the conversation, I again want to express my gratitude for the support that both of you and your communities had in making this happen. We had a strong East St. Louis representation and a strong representation of Illinois PTA parents. And again, truly, we could not have done it without your help. And so I really wanted to start off with what stood out to you all in the report. And I'll start with Art.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. I tell you, a lot did. It really mirrored the things that we had observed here in our community, as well as we put out a survey ourselves, and we surveyed students, parents, as well as teachers and other staff members. And the results that we received practically mirrored the results that you guys just shared. But what stands out the most to me is this learning loss. We use the Northwest Evaluations Educational Assessment tool. It's called the Measures of Academic Progress. And, we were not shocked, but we were disturbed that when we looked at we test kids in the fall, we test them in the spring. So when we compared last fall's testing to this fall's testing, we observed a 5% decrease in the scores of attainment, which is the national norm, in reading, 8% in math, and it was 9% in science. Now, that was disturbing because that's a loss. What we typically see, even when we give that test in the fall, even though there has not been much or any instruction at all, because of what kids learned in the spring, as well as summer school, we typically see an increase of 2 to 5% from our students when they take that fall test. And then when we test them in the spring, we typically will notice and observe a 8 to 10% increase in the areas of reading, math, and science. So again, that decrease, some folks will think, well, 5%, 8%, 9%, that's not that much. It really is because you're not incorporating the loss. We usually have a gain. So that really stands out the most to me. So I know that we have a huge hill to climb to overcome that learning loss. And also, I think those that are familiar with research know that research clearly indicates that when there's an intense learning loss because of a pandemic or any other crisis, that learning loss typically for poor students can be lifelong, and it will impact education, employment, and then of course their earning potential. So our kids are already coming to us behind because of the environment that they're in East St. Louis. And their zip code really should not dictate their destiny. But with this pandemic, if we're not strategic and focused and united, this is going to have a huge lifelong negative impact on our students.
Thanks, sir. I completely agree with you. The effects of this pandemic are not equally felt. We know that our students that, were already in situations that were inequitable, the situation has only worsened. And we need strategies, and we need to be intentional about how we target those supports to the communities most impacted.
Yeah, it's going to take a united front. The other thing is I worry about, of course, right now with the pandemic, the state finances. Right now, districts were held harmless for this school year financially. But for next school year, we think that the picture is not going to be as bright. So we're all concerned about losing valuable income. And we did have some stimulus money that helped us get the things that we needed to help our kids bridge this gap that we're experiencing because of the pandemic. So we were fortunate and were able to give all of our kids Chromebooks. So they had the technology that they needed. But what we could not give them was internet access. We did work with the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, their Office of Broadband Department, but we haven't really seen the fruition yet from the collaboration that we've had with that department. So what we had to do that's not sustainable, we went out and purchased hotspots for our kids. And to keep those hotspots, we got about a little over 2,000 hotspots. That cost us $125,000 a month in order to have those hotspots active so our kids can have internet access. That is not, Jessica, that is not sustainable. We could do it this year because we got some pandemic relief money, but that's not guaranteed for next school year. So we really need the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity to do whatever they can to bridge that gap and put in that infrastructure that our kids need in those zip codes where they don't have the infrastructure for internet access.
Absolutely. Broadband access is extremely important. I know you mentioned funding and the need for advocacy on that front. And Brian, in our conversations with the PTA and in your advocacy with us on school funding, we have these conversations almost every time we talk. What do you think about, what Art Culver shared and what stood out to you in the report? Let me know your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think Jessica and Arthur put his finger on it here, that a lot of the things that the pandemic has highlighted, like it has so much in our society, those problems were there, but they are now very, very visible and front and center. Things like inequities, poverty, healthcare and mental health care ability, access to technology, school funding issues, all those things are really being highlighted by the pandemic. And so we need to be intentional in addressing those and realize that those are the things that we need to address. And the State Board of Education has talked for a long time about addressing the needs of the whole child. Now's the time to walk the walk on that, not just talk the talk, because that's kind of what we've been doing in the past, because it's been there. We've kind of talked about the whole child and their needs and supporting their needs at home and their needs mental health wise and social and emotional learning, but we really haven't stepped up and actually done it as much as we need to. And the other thing that stuck out to me in the report, in all those comments, was something we've known for a long time and that we've said, but it again is really starkly pulled out here. And that is that connections are the key to education. That those relationships that teachers build with students are really critical to student success. I was struck by an Associated Press article I read on Monday talking about the rise in Fs across the country, and talking with, they had a superintendent from Oregon, a district out there, who said that their Fs normally are about 8% of all grades in the district are Fs, and they have now 38%. And in talking with teachers, it's not that students are doing work and not getting it right. It's that students aren't submitting the work. There's not that connection. We have children falling through the cracks, and we need to build those connections, build those family engagement activities, and make sure our teachers have the support and professional development to build that, because that's not something that really is taught much in our education programs at higher education, on how do you engage with families and how do you engage with all families, not just the ones that are, they're contacting you when their child has a problem, but the ones that, get called hard to reach, but, certainly didn't label themselves as hard to reach. That we need to make extra effort out there to make sure those students are not being left behind.
Absolutely.
Jessica,
And yeah.
I'm sorry. And another thing I'd like to mention, because it's equally important. I mentioned the learning loss, and we're about education, so we're always looking at and focused on achievement scores. But also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our kids come from a very challenging background, a lot of poverty. 64% of our kids live below the poverty line. A lot of crime, a lot of trauma, a lot of violence, gang activity. So the social emotional realm, the social and emotional side of the house is really equally important, because it directly impacts a student's ability to learn and a student's ability to even focus on the instructional and the teaching and learning process. So that's equally important. Now, we were very fortunate this year. Our representative, Greenwood, she's with the House of Representatives in Illinois. We were able to get a grant from the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. And that grant gave us some much needed dollars, over $750,000, I believe, to help us in that area. And so through our Director of Parent and Student Support Services, that's Dr. Tiffany Golson, she's over our Family and Community Engagement Center. So we have that grant so that we can provide this year additional social emotional supports for our students. And we know that it's very much needed, because we hear from students, from parents. We have a hotline, and we get a lot of calls about traumatic experiences that are occurring. And a lot of it is primarily due to the pandemic and not having the ability to communicate with educators, teachers, social workers, administrators on 5 days a week like they normally would. So with that grant, we provide support for trauma, social emotional support, counseling, connect them to community services. And so that FACE Center, we call it the FACE Center, the Family Engagement Center, is open from 4 to 9, 7 days a week, including the weekend. So that's really great. Now, what we're wondering is, where will the money come from to continue that program next school year? Because we know that at the end of the school year, there's not going to be a magic day, June 30th, end of the fiscal year, that those needs are going to go away. They're going to continue. So again, we hope that the legislatures and ISB know that, we need more learning time. We need more educational resources. We need more money to extend the school day and have year-round instruction and to get our infrastructure right. But we also got to focus on the whole child and not forget about that social emotional side. And that came out very clearly, I think, in your study also.
Absolutely. I mean, we think of ourselves as adults, like I think all of us are experiencing a traumatic time, and it's hard to focus, right? And we're expecting our children to engage in their academics as if there's nothing happening and there's so much going on. We're living through a pandemic. We are fighting for racial justice. There's so much happening all around us, and we're expecting our students to get online at 8 a.m. and be ready to learn. Right? We need to honor and acknowledge what they're experiencing. And both of you actually take me to my next question. If what we're seeing goes unaddressed, what do you think the long-term impacts could be of what we're experiencing during this pandemic for our students?
Well, go ahead, Brian.
All right. I would say, the critical issue is that disengagement of students is absolutely something that has to be addressed. When we get back to normal life again, assuming that day comes, it can still end up as chronic absenteeism in early dropouts, in remedial classes for students going to college, where those are going to have long-term economic impacts in earning power, because maybe you need an extra semester to make up classes where you're paying college tuition to get those high school knowledge that you didn't get because of the pandemic. So, I mean, I think those are long-term issues that we need to address, make sure that we really engage all those students, give them the support that they need to be successful and get them caught up. And that's going to take resources, and there's no quick way around it. And we're going to have to just work at it for a long time. And that would be my message to everybody out there, is we need to be talking to our legislators about this and making sure that they understand that we support doing this and supporting our kids, because they are a critical thing going forward for the state.
Absolutely.
Yes, Jessica, if we don't put in the systems, programs, people, policies, and practices that are going to put in the systemic kinds of initiatives that we need to overcome the negative impact of the pandemic, it's going to have, as I mentioned earlier, lifelong effects. It's going to affect kids' education. They're going to get frustrated because, when there are learning gaps, when kids know that they're not picking things up the way they should, or they're not keeping up with their peers within their classroom or just statewide, it leads to frustration, and it could cause people to become apathetic and cause some kids to just give up and just quit. And then, of course, that's going to impact their ability to get good employment later on in life. And of course, when adults can't get good jobs, unfortunately, many times they will turn to crime, because regardless of what your job is, it takes a certain amount of money to live. And people are going to do whatever, as we've seen, unfortunately, whatever is necessary in order to make ends meet so they can provide for their families. So I think it could lead to loss of education, of course, high crime, unemployment, lost earning and wages. So it's just imperative that we all focus on this and become united in our efforts to overcome the negative impacts of this pandemic.
Absolutely. And we'll need both educational recovery, economic recovery, because we know that the rates of unemployment are increasing by the day, right? And we don't know what this winter is going to bring. One of the things that we asked our participants of the focus groups during these conversations as we were closing out is that, the reality is that there's a lot of challenges, and there's also a lot of bright spots. Like, people are coming together in ways that we never have before. But I'm very curious to know from you all, what would you prioritize in a world where we're limited on resources and we don't know what the recovery is going to look like, but we potentially, A, we all have a role in this, and B, we can have a say in how priorities are determined. As it relates to education, what do you think we should be thinking about at the top?
Well, in my opinion, there's just tons of research to show that time on task, if you're doing the right things, increased time on task has a direct impact on increased student achievement. So we have to focus on ways to increase time on task. There's ways to do that, but it could cost. For example, you can lengthen the school day. Well, if you increase the school day, most people, teachers, unions are going to want to be paid for that. You can increase the school year. That's another way to increase time on task. That's going to cost. I think this pandemic has done one good thing for education, and that's to let us know the profound positive impact technology can have on education. So that's one thing that we can do. We're going to continue to let our students have these Chromebooks so that even when school is over, they can continue their learning through technology, even after the school day. So I think you just got to find ways to increase time on task, lengthen the school day, year-round school, and also increase time on task through technology resources. But we must, again, address these infrastructure challenges that we have, like here in East St. Louis and other parts of the state, some rural areas, as well as some areas that may be urban but poor. Kids must have access to connectivity in order to continue to keep up with their peers. The other thing too, Jessica, is that we're going to see more of our students enter college taking remedial courses because they didn't get the things they needed in K-12 because of the pandemic. Again, it has effects that last for generations if you don't find ways to make up for the loss. And so when you increase the need for remedial courses, that of course increased the cost of college. It takes kids longer to graduate because they're taking courses, and sometimes for up to a year or a little longer, courses that don't even count towards college graduation. But it's just to make up for the learning gap that existed because of things like the pandemic.
Absolutely. Brian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Arthur really put it on there, time on task, but the key to that is resources.
Yeah.
And we've got our legislators right now talking about what we're going to do with our budget next year. And I think when legislators look at a state budget, they tend to look at it in terms of costs. This costs that much, this costs that much, this other thing costs that much. And we need to get the message out to our legislators that not everything is a cost. When you fund education, it's not a cost, it's an investment.
Right.
That, I know a University of Illinois professor probably about 5 years ago calculated the return on investment for what Illinois gets in the money they put into pre-K and elementary and secondary schools and higher education. And the return on investment on all those investments was much higher than the rate of return if we had stuck the money in the Standard & Poor 500 fund. It is a positive benefit back to the state when we invest in education, and we get those dollars back fairly quickly. And it also goes to the point that Arthur made where we retard students because of this, where they come out of college with more costs. It delays when they can maybe buy a house or start a family, but it also means that it reduces what they're paying in state taxes, so resources for the state in the future as well. So we need to get that message out to our legislators right now while they are discussing the budget, that education needs to be at the front of the line, that we need to make sure our schools have these resources, that our kids have the ability to catch up on what they've missed, to make them be successful when they graduate college or high school and go into the job market. Because we know that those kids who go to school in Illinois often go to college in Illinois and then get a job in Illinois and become an Illinois taxpayer. And we saw back when we had the budget stalemate and higher education wasn't getting funding, Missouri and Iowa and Indiana and Alabama were poaching our top students, offering them free college scholarships because they wanted to take the best students out of Illinois, and those students probably don't come back afterwards. So we need to make sure that we are investing in education from pre-K all the way up through higher education.
That's right.
Supporting our children, because that's critical for our state's success in the long term. And that's the message that we need to have everybody contacting their legislator and putting that in their ear right now while they are discussing the budget.
Absolutely. And everyone here, we've got over 100 people on. So you all know that I will definitely be sending a call to action so that we fight for that funding that's necessary. And truly, Brian, we need to invest in our children to invest in the future of our state. And we want to keep our people here. right?
Right,
We want to
right.
keep, I think of my brother growing up right now. I want him to stay
Mhm.
here. I want him to pursue college and come back and do the work in my community that I'm from and I grew up in, so it's very important. And I completely agree with everything you're both sharing. And I know that we have some questions in the Q&A. I want to bring Melissa back on to help me with some of those questions that are coming to both of you, some potentially to some of us at Advance. So Melissa, take it away.
Sure, Jess. And I just want to say thank you to the participants for putting in those questions. Just by nature of the limited time that we have, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. So I'm going to try to call out a couple, and then what we'll try to do is follow up offline via email to answer the rest. Some of the responses so far that Brian and Art have given have responded to this notion of like, what do we know about instructional strategies or interventions to address the need? And I think both of you have spoken to kind of instructional time and making sure that we're just investing both in social emotional and kind of trauma responsive practices as well as academics.
Mm-hmm.
We had a question kind of related to that about what strategies can be implemented to ensure that the whole community is part of that process of recovery and not just kind of the school.
I'll take a stab at it. I think you have to really, educators, and we do this here in East St. Louis, you have to really have the philosophy that everything that others will have to implement, support, have a strong feeling about, or be affected by are at the table before final decisions are made. They should be at the table in the developmental process. So it behooves educators to come up with a systematic way to engage all stakeholders. For example, here in East St. Louis, we have, of course, we meet with our staff. We have what we call the Superintendent's Communication Council, where staff members from all schools and all departments gather quarterly just to talk about what are our issues, how are we doing, how can we improve. We do the same thing with our students. I meet with upper elementary students at the 4th and 5th grade level, middle school students and high school students separately. I do that quarterly just to find out from them, how is it going? What can we do better? What are your concerns? What are your needs? And I tell you what, the information that we get is just so valuable. And then we do the same thing with our parents. We have what we call a key communicator network meeting quarterly, where we will share some bright spots, but then 80% of the meeting, or if not 85 to 90% of the meeting, is for them to give us feedback. We share with them our challenges, our concerns, and they share with us what they're concerned about, how they think that we can do better. So I think it's just, it's imperative that all of us have a collaborative approach to what we, to how we conduct our business in our individual school districts. And it's also imperative that educators adopt a philosophy that we have done here in East St. Louis, where we use a diagnostic prescriptive approach to instruction. In other words, it's not just a one size fit all, but we really, honestly, most kids, it's almost like every kid has an individual educational plan. We use that diagnostic prescriptive approach so that formative assessments, as well as summative assessments, will guide instruction, and they will inform whole group instruction or whole class instruction, small group instruction or cooperative groups, as well as, most importantly, individualized instruction. And you got to put in systems to make sure that educators are utilizing that data. Now is the time, again, I want to just harp on one more thing, for the governor, the General Assembly, and all of our legislatures to truly put kids first. It's now more imperative than ever to put kids first. And I know with the evidence-based funding model, that's been good. I think they need $350 million a year, new money put in education. Well, you know what? Because of the pandemic, I would guess that they will need at least $500 million a year. So how will we find it? I think we're going to have to make some sacrifices and in some other areas to truly put children first, because $350 million a year, new money a year in education is not going to get the job done because of what the pandemic has done to us. It's going to take at least $500 million. And then my last thing is to implore our educators and our governor rather, and our legislatures to really understand the concept that equal treatment, when it's clear that needs are unequal, is not justice, it's not equality, and it's not equity. So we got to be courageous enough to put, they have to be courageous enough to put more resources where the needs are clearly outlined, that they're greater than some other places. And sometimes that's not popular, but equal treatment when the needs are unequal, that's not justice. It's not equality, it's not equity. So we just got to focus on where the need is and put the resources there.
Thank you, Superintendent. That was
Thank
an
you.
excellent, detailed answer. I really appreciate it.
I'm sorry to be long-winded. But
No, that's perfect. And you read my mind, because one of the kind of follow-up questions was going to be, if you had a message for legislators, what would it be? And I think you just really hit the message home with EBF. I really appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
And you're
Yes,
speaking
ma'am.
truth. Speaking truth. I appreciate it.
Thank
Exactly.
you.
So I'm going to try quickly to just kind of, I can answer one of these questions quickly. I have one that I'm going to lob at Jess, and then we can wrap it up. But we had a couple of questions related to how we might think about A, resource equity, and B, kind of comparability of student outcomes and grades across schools or districts when we have these two modalities of in-person and remote instruction. Actually, I would say 3, hybrid instruction as well at the same time. And my instinct is to say that that's where the data piece comes in. I haven't seen necessarily large scale kind of comparisons of what resources look like across those contexts and how outcomes are looking across those contexts. I'd be curious to know from you guys just really quickly, are you kind of looking at any comparisons and in terms of how students are doing and what they're experiencing across the in-person and remote modalities?
Well, I can, I'll be short. Brian, they want to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that one's more on yours, Arthur.
Okay, I thought so. But honestly, we can't compare modalities, because unfortunately here in East St. Louis, the positivity rate is so high. We're seeing about 55 to 60 cases, new cases in our serving zip codes per day. We started out this year with remote, and we're still in remote learning. This year, though, we did something different than we did in the spring. Last spring, remote learning was done from teachers' homes. And based on the feedback that we got from our students and our families through our survey, this year in August, we brought everybody back to work. So teachers were conducting the remote learning through in their classrooms. And what that did, that gave them the ability to collaborate more. They had more access to technology support and curriculum support, as well as we were able to even provide more support for socio-emotional needs for our students, as well as technology needs. When kids would have issues with technology, we would send our technology integration specialists out to homes and get kids connected, help them resolve whatever those issues were.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
So
Okay,
I'm sorry, we just
Ryan,
can't compare it to, we don't have the hybrid. We wanted to do hybrid, but the data just didn't support it. Also, we've had 76 staff members to come down with COVID. We've had 1 staff member to die from it, unfortunately, and some with some serious consequences that still are being worked on by their physicians and themselves to overcome. So we just haven't been able to, unfortunately, bring kids back, but we plan to do it this in January. We really hope that we can do it, but we have to be first and foremost concerned about the health and safety of everybody, because we know that many of our students also live with parents or grandparents that have significant health issues. And if they catch COVID, it could be very deadly and causing even more trauma for our students.
we appreciate that. Yeah.
thanks, Art.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
I
I think
know
that-
we're reaching time, and I want to give Brian one chance, from the PTA perspective, if you had one message to decision makers, what would that message be?
Well, for the legislators, I've already told you, put education first. For people talking to their school districts, their school boards, I would say, make sure you're investing in family engagement. It's a way to stretch dollars. We know from research that a truly engaged family in their child's education, not just sending newsletters home or things like that, but where the parents and the teachers are working in partnership on a student's education. It's the equivalent in terms of what you get in academic success of spending an extra $1,000 on that kid. So that's a way to stretch our limited dollars, is make sure we're engaging our families, making our parents and our caregivers partners in their child's education. They already are. They're tech support people at home, you know, getting those kids online and making sure they're working on their homework and things like that. But engaging all those families and making sure that they are there and they have the resources they need to help their kid at home when they can't go to a teacher for help necessarily. I think that's the message we need to be getting out to our school districts, our superintendents, our school boards, our principals. Help our parents engage with their teachers.
And parents are more engaged than ever. So I completely agree. So
Jessica,
thank you both. Do you want to add
part
one more note?
Just one note. I'm begging our legislatures, our governor, to listen to the practitioners. We're on the ground. We've been in this for quite some time. Some of us, like myself, over 40 years. So this is a time to listen, and listen to the teachers' unions. They have a lot of knowledge, and they hear from their teachers and their members. So this is listen to the Illinois State Board of Education, listen to the state superintendent, and really, try to do the right thing, and be courageous enough to make the right decisions, because the teachers union, the administrative organizations like Illinois Association of School Administrators, the Illinois State Board staff members, the state superintendent, they're going to tell you what we need. Listen and be courageous.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for joining. And, we're over time, so I just want to take a couple minutes to thank you both for joining me in this conversation, again, for your support in the success of these focus groups, and really the road ahead, right? We're going to be doing this together. You're stuck with me for a while, I'll say that, with all of Advance Illinois. And so it took so many of our partners to make this a success. And again, I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank the partners that helped make this a success. My team at Advance Illinois, Melissa played such a key role in helping draft this report. And really, I want to make sure that you all, as I said, I can't help but end these without a call to action. That's just who I am. And please, if you haven't read the report, I hope that this conversation encourages you to visit our website, read the report, share it with your network, share it with your friends, with your colleagues, and especially with the decision makers in your community, with legislators, with school district leaders, with the educators in your community. Have conversations about it and invite them to join us in advocacy in the months and the years ahead. We know that this work is not going to end this legislative session. We're going to have to do the work for our kids. And as mentioned in the panel, our kids come first, and we need to prioritize education both now and in the years ahead.